for joining us today for our webinar on covering business in these changing times. I'm Linda Conway. I'm the Executive Director of NEMPA, and I'd like to introduce Jim Pomeroy. Jim writes, speaks, and provides training on community newsroom success strategies. He is the author of Journalism Primer, a guide to community news coverage, Votes and Quotes, a guide to outstanding election coverage, and Bad News and Good Judgment, a guide to reporting on sensitive issues in small town newspapers. He's worked with newspapers all over the country. He writes columns in a lot of the association's monthly bulletins, as well as NEMPA. We've known Jim for years, and he's a terrific resource. A few housekeeping notes. We're going to mute everybody. Everybody will be muted. Please use the chat button at the bottom if you have any questions. You should have received some handouts that we sent along. If you want to use those, Jim will reference those throughout the webinar. You can use them to write notes. We'll also be sending out an email to all of you afterwards that includes a copy of the recording along with another link to the notes. So Jim, I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you, Linda. Welcome everybody to today's conversation on strengthening business news. And I really emphasize conversation. I welcome your comments, your feedback throughout. The greater exchange we have today is just will give you more ideas and policies to think about and bring back to your newsrooms to tailor to your newsrooms. The slide deck, as we get into it, kind of high level, as Linda mentioned, you received handouts in advance, and also is posted the link to the handouts is posted on the chat, so you can download them now. Business news obviously has never been more center stage in newspapers than today. COVID-19 has a tremendous impact on the economy and on employment. That necessarily has spawned a range of stories focusing on our work sites, the places where we work as employees, the places where we shop and purchase products and services as consumers. Business lockdowns and restrictions have really redefined commerce and reshaped daily routines. Business news clearly deserves extra attention during these extraordinary times. My pitch today is to also, during this time, think about incorporating business news, broadening business coverage during the ordinary times. Stories about employers and employees have a huge impact on communities. And I think we probably all can reference or examples where something happening with an employer in town may have a bigger impact on your town and be bigger headlines in your newspaper than a vote of the city council or the school board the night before. That said, it's still, many newspapers I think struggle for consistent coverage. I'm hoping today offers some tips to turn that around. It's impractical for many newsrooms to devote one person to report on business. My pitch is just to talk about business news in your regular regimen of news gathering, just as you discuss local government coverage, sports coverage. Today's webinar hopefully offers some practical steps for that. And also we'll offer some pointers when you're dealing with business news. Often you reach the challenging news, the news which is not the good news and the bad news for employers, and offer some tips to tell employers why they should share the bad news as well as the good news. And again, I'm a firm believer that if you strengthen and develop your business news, it can lead to some increased revenue. I bring a special perspective to today's webinar. For 27 years, I worked at small newspapers in Minnesota, sister newspapers in Red Wing and in International Falls, one on the Wisconsin border, one on the Canadian border. For 21 years, I was editor at Red Wing, the chief gatekeeper. I said the yay and nay to what got in the paper, what didn't get in the paper. Clearly, business news requests constantly flowed in. In my second career, for the last 16 years, and my job was eliminated 4 months ago due to COVID, so I have appreciation for the impact of COVID on business, but I was the director of communications for the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce, which is the state's largest business advocacy organization. In addition, during my 10 years editor at Red Wing, I served on the Chamber Board of Directors, local Chamber Board of Directors for 6 years, 2 years as its president. I also served on the State Chamber Board of Directors. Don't misinterpret. You're not going to hear a steady barrage of why you should print every single business news request that crosses your desk, especially those stories with a positive spin in the eyes of the business. Rather, my goal is to really to broaden your perspective on what is business news, to make it a regular part of your newsroom discussions. I also advise you to go slowly on developing business coverage, especially if you don't do a lot of it now. You just can't turn on the spigot. Business news can be challenging as we get into, especially in the discussion of the good news and the bad news. But developing a plan, I do believe, can produce some long-term dividends for both solid content, interesting content, and for advertising revenue. We're going to flip, if I do this right, onto the PowerPoint. And so let's begin on business and everyday beat. Here's the agenda for today. The agenda mirrors what's on the table of contents for your handouts. We'll talk about developing policy. We'll discuss what I refer to as the elements of coverage. And then we'll also talk about generating story ideas, spend some time on that, generating revenue. I'm a firm believer in explaining newspaper policies and operations, and I have a handful of columns in your handouts on some of the examples. A discussion of business news inevitably prompts many editors to focus on the routine Main Street occurrences. A clothing store celebrates its grand opening. A restaurant opens up offering a distinctive cuisine. A flower shop celebrates its 25th anniversary. These stories, though worthy of recognition and worthy of some mention in your newspaper, underscores an underlying point from my perspective, is that business news is much broader than those items that typically would wind up in a Chamber of Commerce newsletter. Again, incorporate business news into your everyday coverage. Think for a minute, the hours, think of yourself, your family, your friends, the number of hours you spend on the job, not only in the office, but the extended hours. Think also of the range of businesses in your communities, large, small, all types and sizes, and what they mean to the local fabric of your community, what they really mean to the quality of life in your communities. Then take a minute and look through several editions of your publications, and just glance over, do it, look over a couple months worth. And does your coverage really reflect the broad impact of businesses, the people and their jobs in your communities? Today's discussion also, I hope to broaden your attention to business news in a couple of other ways. Number one, business news, like so many other aspects of your news operations, is easily misunderstood by readers. How many times have you been approached to do a business-related story? It might be the standard grand opening. It might be a labor strike. It might relate to some company that says, this is kind of a really distinctive industry, and it warrants some attention in your newspaper or in your other publications. Your response, your decision, whether to pursue or not pursue the story, deserves an explanation, not only to the inquiring business, but also on occasion, a good explanation to your general readership. During my tenure as editor at Red Wing, I wrote a weekly column on newspaper operations and policies. There's a whole range of stories, range of policy you can write about outside of business. But also today, I think you'll see some opportunities where you can discuss business policies and business decisions to your readers. Number two, credible coverage of business can lead to increased revenue. I firmly believe that. Be clear, this does not mean saying yes to every single advertiser request. Newspapers are in the strongest position by having a clear separation between news and advertising. That's in the best interest of both your departments, and you clearly want to be on the same page so that your internal message is the same as you're giving to your external message. That said, news and advertising should have regular conversations, so you do have a clear understanding of what is news and advertising. Bottom line, I believe that if you show the business community that you have a plan for continuing substantive coverage, it can produce long-term dividends for content and for revenue. A few questions to frame today's discussion. What's the biggest challenge you have faced in reporting business news? Are your news and advertising departments on the same page? What's the biggest complaint from businesses or readers on your business coverage? And what's the most unorthodox business news story you've ever published? Developing business news and organizing your business coverage is no different than figuring out how you're going to cover the local budget, the school district budget, or government meetings, or sports coverage, or any other area. You'll win higher marks from your readers and your advertisers if you have a plan, if you have fair and consistent coverage, and you have a plan and do it in a credible way. I'm a firm believer in, especially when you're kind of approaching coverage in some specific areas in your newspaper, of a 3-step process. And some of this is outlined again on your handouts. Set the policy, implement the policy, and explain the policy. It's you'll be most successful if you kind of have a plan. Set the policy, just a couple questions, and I referenced it earlier. What is news and what is advertising? If it's news, do you have some standard guidelines for business openings, business anniversaries, business promotions? And you have kind of some standard policy for the standard fare of business news. Who sets the policy? Are your news and advertising departments aligned, which we've mentioned. Number 2, implementing the policy. Once the policies are in place, you really have to stick to them. Yes, exceptions are certain to arise, and be open to discuss and review and make your decision of how to proceed. Probably the biggest challenge you face in implementing the policy is the what versus the whom. And by that, I mean, in simplest terms, it must be clear that the biggest advertiser does not deserve special treatment for news decisions. And that can be treatment both in asking for something to be published or something to be withheld from publication. And finally, explain the policy, be proactive and not reactive. Don't forget to first make the case internally, be aligned on what your policies are, and then as appropriate, explain it to your readers. I can't overemphasize the value of explaining to readers. I looked at my weekly column as having a conversation with readers. It wasn't that this news decision we made was the right decision or the only decision, but it helped them understand our decision-making process and let them understand we just didn't do this on a whim, we thought this through. And it actually resulted in some good exchange on the editorial page. Among some of the examples that you could talk about in the column with readers is, do you have a standard format for announcing new businesses? Do you publish letters to the editor, complimentary or critical of a business? Businesses love to promote the good news. How do you approach the bad news? Some of these, such as the column on how do you handle new businesses, a standard process, you could do that almost any time, kind of evergreen column. Other columns you might want to write with respect to some specific thing which is in the newspaper and reference it, some recent event. Fairness and consistent coverage. All editors and reporters strive for fair and consistent coverage in all aspects of your news gathering. And I think this is extra sensitive or pay extra attention in business coverage, because if you're writing about a business, the sensitivity, of course, the underlying sensitivity is that you are writing about possibly a current advertiser or a potential advertiser, and they're going to be sensitive to their dollars, how they proceed with your publications, generate profitability for your newspapers. And so just be aware that they're going to have that extra sensitivity. It doesn't mean that you should bend the rules. You want to be fair and consistent, but understand there's an extra sensitivity with the interviewees probably in this case. And that can be with a lot of different stories you do, but I think especially in business. It's my intent today that everybody leaves with something. For those maybe new to the business or haven't done much of business reporting, maybe this will give you a couple ideas, a couple steps to start that process. For the veterans, see what you're doing. Maybe this will offer some ideas to kind of tweak what you're doing, to go a different direction, to add some things to your existing coverage. And for everybody, I hope it does offer some ideas that you can take back to rethink, review your policies, your coverage, and think of ways that you can both go forward in increasing content and increasing advertising revenue. So we're going to talk about the elements of the coverage and what I kind of characterize as the elements of business coverage. Editors often raise red flags or at least hesitate on requests for business news, and usually for good reason. A store asks for its grand opening, and I've seen it, you probably have all seen it, request grand opening 3 months after it actually opened its doors, but they want the grand opening story too. a request for a restaurant review might be pretty interesting. It might say, that's a good idea. You hesitate because you've never done it before. There's always that chance to you set precedent. If you do one restaurant review, will you get follow-up requests? And also the request for the anniversary story, which we've all heard. The nursery comes in and says, we're celebrating our anniversary. Oh, and by the way, we are one of your largest advertisers. Advertising departments can be quick to promote business coverage for the promised dividend of more revenue. And that may well be the case, but be aware, I caution that having haphazard coverage can be worse than no coverage at all. Newspapers instead, I believe, in business news should take a tip from the sports playbook. A deliberate and steady offense will minimize your need to defend what you're doing. Have policies, have guidelines, and you'll be on more solid ground as you do your business coverage. Clearly, newsrooms should craft guidelines in consultation with advertising and management. Exceptions are always are certain to surface, but they ought to be rare. Again, having credible, steady coverage is your best bet. So the first element that I refer to element coverage, think beyond the chamber newsletter. For many newspapers, I'm afraid we were probably guilty of it in Red Wing for many years, is that business coverage is synonymous with the Chamber of Commerce and the red coats. I think we all know the red coats. These are the business reps at the Chamber of Commerce and board members that go out and greet new businesses. Typically, they acknowledge them. They acknowledge an opening or an expansion or a new promotion, specific promotion. I wore a red coat for many years. I did it. One newspaper literally, not Red Wing, fortunately, but one newspaper literally every month ran a full page of the red coat visits. One page, 8 pictures. Each picture had 10 people in it. Each picture, 9 of the 10 people were the same. You get the drift, the 9 ambassadors, and the only difference was the representative, the local business representative. You know, sorry, that's not news for the newspaper. That's for the chamber newsletter. You should acknowledge business expansion. You should acknowledge business promotions. You should acknowledge new businesses, but do it in a significant way and focus on the business, not on the 9 people who are wearing their red jackets and getting their picture in the paper every month, 9 times on a page every month. But having said, the other thing to be aware of is that I experienced it, that these chamber ambassador visits, which you probably all recognize, they sometimes make that visit 2 or 3 or 4 months after the fact. I mean, after an expansion or promotion. So if you're really presenting this in your newspaper as business news, you are behind the times. Most of the community probably is aware of this occurrence already. Having said all that, look at, you should have communication connection with chambers of commerce, with economic development organizations, with labor organizations. Embrace the networking. They often hear about things on the ground level. They may know, it's a great place for a water cooler of ideas. And so they might say, did you hear, this is opening up in 3 weeks or 4 months, or this place is looking to locate a facility in your community. So you're prepped for it. You can follow it and you can be aware of it and develop a plan. And also, like I say, water cooler of ideas. It's a great place just to get ideas on all sorts of things. You're having coffee at the chamber and somebody says, hey, they might have a neat employee story, or it might be just, did you hear that this is going on next week across town? So-and-so organization is doing this. And so you're gonna also just enrich your everyday menu of stories by going and hanging out with the folks. Second element that I refer to is preparing for the interview.
Hey, Jim?
Yes.
Can I interrupt you real quick?
Sure.
Somebody just sent me a question.
Yeah.
They wanted to know if you have any suggestions on how to develop relationships with business leaders.
I think my big point there is to start small and take baby steps. And one of the things that, today we're kind of in the virtual world. I mean, so maybe you do a Zoom session, but I'm a big believer, maybe having a brown bag lunch, just inviting and select some business leaders from whether they're retail, manufacturing, large business, small business, but just bring them in and say, we want to have a frank and open discussion what do you think of our business coverage? What can we do? How can we improve? You have to make it clear that in the end, you have limited resources. So, you can't do everything, but welcome their ideas. And the other part of it you might want to think about is, is this a discussion just with the news department? If you have management or advertising participate in that, that's fine. That's something you want to discuss, but be sure you're all aligned. So when you are talking, if they're pitching out something, an idea, that you don't get one perspective from the news staff, one perspective from the advertising. But I think, but I'm a firm believer that if you can, if we ever reach a normalcy, calling up the bank president and saying, let's have lunch, let's have a cup of coffee, or a lot of downtowns, merchants, they have their regular coffee clutches in the morning or a few times a week at the local restaurant. Pop your face in there, talk with them, just start a discussion. Become a little more familiar. And the part of that too, not only might you discuss business coverage, but you'll find that can really be a pool for forwarding other ideas, for just a bunch of good story ideas for other sections of your paper. But again, take the baby steps, and move forward. Again, I'm talking about an element of coverage of preparing for the interview. Prep yourself. If you're sitting down to cover cover the city budget, you're going to read the documents before you go in the meeting. Many writers get the cold shoulder because a business can vividly remember it's been burned. They did a review, did an interview, and you got the call the next day saying, where was that reporter? That might happen from a city council meeting too. But prep yourself, understand the dynamics of the industry. Good example, Red Wing Shoe Company in Red Wing sells product worldwide. Not many people know that there's only about a handful of companies in the United States that make footwear. Most footwear is imported. And so that's, you bring that to the table, the interviewee is impressed that you understand kind of what their industry is. You can put that in the context of in the story, it offers context for the story. And so just, do your homework. You might look at annual reports before doing an interview, depending on the depth of the interview. You might look at reports on this company in other publications, in trade publications. Number two, you want a balanced story, and this can sometimes be challenging for the business, but you have to let them understand, in many cases, avoid the single source story. You want to do that in a variety of reports in your newspaper. And so they have to understand that you're going to seek the other voices. And maybe a couple of quick examples. I mean, these voices can be competing voices to their story, or it can be complementary. As example, let's say local healthcare organizations are preparing to a merger. They say, this is good for us, more services, we'll draw in more people from a wider area, more businesses, more customers for Red Wing. And they're not gonna probably give you the downside. And there will be detractors. And actually, if they should understand that they probably, if they've done their homework and strategized, they know some of the competing arguments, the opposing arguments, but they may not know all. If you, first of all, it's your responsibility to give those voices in your newspaper, but also it might pop up for the, to the promoter. They might say, we weren't even aware of that concern. This is something we really have to strategize and work on if this project is gonna get its necessary approval and be successful. Another quick one in Red Wing, we had the mall, big box retailer was being lured to a mall development on the outskirts of town. They were also going to do tax incentives for the mall. And so the proponents said, again, it'll increase the market. It'll bring more people into Red Wing. They'll come to our mall, to our big box. They'll filter downtown. Downtown merchants said, we're 4 miles from that. Will they ever get down here? Will this compete with already our fragile economy? And so again, but your responsibility is to present all voices, but it can be a positive for the companies for making them aware of what the competing interests are. And ask the question, there's nothing worse if you're doing for an interview with anybody, but especially I think in a business interview, if you're doing the interview and the interviewee is looking at the reporter with a blank stare and wondering, did they get this? why don't they ask me the question? Do they really understand what's the story going to look like in the next day's publication? As a follow-up to that, writing for your readers, and this, of course, pertains to any story you're writing in any coverage. But if you don't understand it, the readers won't either. A lot of local business stories are probably pretty straightforward, and they go fine. This probably is more with, you probably all have communities where you have corporations that have a facility in your community, and you get the batch of corporate press releases. And if you get a release that says reporting the dividends on your earnings, probably a 2-3 sentence, put in your news in a business brief. Be aware, you'll get a 1.5-page press release on the earnings. You'll have 2 paragraphs of news and 3/4 of a page of who the company is and what they are and why they're the best in the market, et cetera. Distill it to the news. But the bigger challenge, I think, and this is on finding the local angle, is let's say this corporation which has a facility in your community is expanding or laying off or acquiring another business. It may be right having to do with your facility or a facility elsewhere in another state or another country. But it can have an impact if they buy a company somewhere else. What's the impact on the local facility? You need the local angle. The challenge is if you call the local manager, the local communication person, their orders, unfortunately, is to pop all inquiries up to corporate headquarters. And corporate communications, unfortunately, only speaks on the corporate level. You've got to be firm. You've got to tell them that if you want this in our newspaper, if this is impact, we have to know how this impacts the local facility. We have to know how this affects our local town, the people in our town. And so you just have to be firm. I want to follow up for writing for your readers. I have to read this word for word because I roll my eyes every time I do it. I'm going to read the story and then give you the background. But the newspaper will remain anonymous, and the first word, publishers, the story identify the publisher is remaining anonymous here, but it says the publishers, parent company of this newspaper, announced it has agreed to the terms of a restructuring agreement. A news release on the company's website said that the agreement is with the holders of more than 75% of its outstanding senior subordinated notes. If the restructuring is approved, the holders of the $278.5 million in outstanding notes would exchange their existing notes for $100 million of new second lien secured notes. Wow. Now I know Linda shared that there's some business editors on this call, and there's I think a business publication, and maybe you can decipher this, but bottom line is that the parent company of this newspaper was in bankruptcy and doing reorganization. This story appeared on the newspaper's front page, and I can tell you the rest of the story was just as much financial jargon as this. Why do they run it? If you're going to run something, most reporters probably wouldn't understand this at a glance, and I guarantee that I share readers probably say what, and so you write for your readers. News and advertising of staffs frequently receive requests for business news coverage. My advice again, pay offense, have a plan for what's news, what's advertising, and then have kind of your some templates for standard things like business openings, guidelines for anniversaries, business closings. You remember you've got to be the filter, because a business admittedly might pitch a story to you with some rose-colored glasses, and their interest, in their perspective, everything they have to offer is a great news story that should be shared. And they're looking at ways to stretch their advertising dollars with some earned media, free media. Don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting at all that you develop policies that you say no to all requests. Quite the opposite. Develop policies so you can have a rationale, a good reason for saying yes to some and no to others. Business openings, I talked about this a little bit earlier, but the news is when the business opens, not the grand opening 3 months later. So that's your responsibility. You have to be on top of the news. If a building is going up, if you see it driving around town, check it out. If the advertising department tells you, hey, we just placed a classified ad for an employer which is going to open up in 3 months and they're looking for employees, check it out. If you hear a buzz around town, check it out. The business opening is news. The grand opening 3 months later is not. So be on top of it. Have a plan for how you announce business openings. Find a distinctive element. Find something. There's all kinds of perspectives that you can probably bring to, I find a distinctive element to a new business. And then have probably the accompanying info box. That's, standard information, address, hours of operation, website address, phone numbers, the website there. And you might also, maybe you want to, have a little mugshot, a little bio on the local manager or the local owner.
Jim, can I interrupt again?
Sure, go ahead, Linda.
I just had another question from somebody asking, what if your publisher comes into your office and demands preferential news treatment for a personal friend who's a large advertiser?
That's tough. And I'm sorry to say that in some cases, the publisher, he or she will rule, and you end up doing it against your better judgment and strong objections. But I would really make the strong point I'd argue to the publisher that you want fair and consistent coverage. You want your coverage to be credible. If you, it's in the best interest for your news and advertising staffs. If you may bend the rule for one, your ad rep's going to go out and someone else is going to say, hey, so-and-so got this. Why can't I get the same favor? And I think that news travels. I mean, I guarantee whenever we bent the rules or tweaked them a little bit for somebody, I would get the phone call that said, hey, you told me yes or no on this. Why did this one get that favor? So I think it's really, if you want to have credible coverage and be able to have the same message externally as internally, you have to be on the same page, and also be aware that kind of the what can extend beyond business news. I mean, I can tell you, I had a firsthand experience where, the friend of the publisher wanted to keep something out of the police blotter, or somebody else said, somebody else wanted to get something in, and not a business news item, some other business item. It never would have gotten the newspaper under our normal filtering of what's news and what's not news. But if they get it in one spot, they'll try it another way.
Thanks, Jim.
The guidelines for anniversaries for any business, I'm sure we all, and especially today in the COVID, every year, every day their operation is significant. And I had somebody that came up to me and said, hey, we survived our first year. That is incredible. And we did not do the story. I forget what the reasons were. Actually, I think they approached us for their first year anniversary like 2 years after they were in business. But, it may have been a great story. I think, you should evaluate those. I'll obviously be aware of the precedent you set that if you do a story on one first-year anniversary, the other requests are certainly to follow. But it may be interesting. It might be good content. Consider it. On the flip side, we had a nursery that came into us for our annual Progress Edition celebrating their 90th year. Natural story. We did it. It's perfect. A no-brainer. The next 3 years for our Progress Edition, they came and said, could we have a story for our 91st year in business, 92nd year in business, 93rd year in business? Great news for them. Great way to promote an ad. It's not going to find the news pages. You have to understand, you kind of have to question their quest for some free publicity. Benchmarks of 50, 75, 100 years is probably pretty natural, automatic for news stories. You might consider 10 years, 25 years. Brainstorm it, have a plan. And again, you can kind of have a policy. Is an anniversary worth a photo and a cut line? Is it worth an inside page section or a front page? Is it worth a story and a photo? Again, inside news, front page news. Do you do something on your web? Do you do a video and give a promotion on the web? Again, have a policy, have the discussion. Some things you'll have a plan for, other things will come out of the blue. And so then you have the internal discussion and figure out how to do it. Business closings, a lot of that going on today with the pandemic, and I'm sure everybody is, business owners they're sad, but I mean, they're probably pretty willing to to tell the circumstances and why they're closing. And I'm guessing everybody in 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months, a year from now, will do stories on what's the local business landscape from retail to manufacturing. How does it look compared to a year ago before the pandemic hit? But understand business closings can be challenging. Not everybody's going to want to talk about them kind of in ordinary times. They may not. There may be specific reasons. It may be a worthwhile story. The one thing I caution on business closings is it's easier to keep track of business openings. It's probably more difficult on business closings. And so if you want to have some consistency or something, it's something to think about, but just to have the discussion. Another element that I think that I'm really a big proponent of, that I hope today gives us some ideas, is developing a regular presence of business news in your pages. And so again, you know, people in the news, devote a section or a page, profile a business, always solicit items. If it's on your website, if it's on your newspaper, in the print edition, say, if you have an item, call me, send this email. A lot of newspapers have a solicitation for news items, for sports news, for letters to the editor. I would specifically have a section that that line that says business news. It shows that you're paying attention to business news. Reporting the good news and the bad news. You can't have a discussion on business coverage without talking about reporting the good news and bad news. The big thing, a quick example, we had a mutual insurance company in Red Wing, and 50 employees were out of jobs after the parent company closed it. No press release. We found out about an employee. We reported the story 2 days later, and we called the corporate communications. They grudgingly acknowledged it, but they never issued a press release. In contrast, several years earlier, when they purchased this company, they actually came into our newsroom for an hour, told us about the story, told us about why, told us from their perspective, the positive impact. They came and told us, sat with our newsroom in the morning before they even announced the purchase to the employees in the afternoon. The bottom line, they're willing to talk about good news. They don't want to share the bad news. You run the same thing with government bodies. The difference is government bodies, you have laws that say they have to, data practice laws and open meeting laws where they have to share it. You don't get that in private business. Does not have the same parameters. I'm a firm believer in telling them the truth squelches the rumors. We've all heard business news, layoffs that are probably worse than the reality. The business, I tell them, tell the story up front. Give us the press, volunteer it, and send us a press release. Be the first with the bad news. Then they're laying the benchmark. They're laying the framework for the community discussion. You may have people that say, yeah, that's right, that's just company line, but you've got it out there. You've laid the benchmark for the discussion, and that will help. I think that's a very positive for them. We had some businesses that all of a sudden they started routinely doing that to us because they got the bad feedback on earlier layoffs, and this time they said, we're gonna be first with it. And they said it was a better deal for them. Be honest with employers and with yourselves. If a company keeps telling you all, keeps willingly volunteer, pitch the good news, but they don't share the bad news, you're a little suspect in saying, if you really want the good news, you got to share the bad news. And so I just think that it's a solid, it's a shared responsibility. Be substantive and solid in your reporting, and that'll go a long way on reporting that. I want to, I'm watching our time here. I want to go through some special circumstances. These again are in your handouts. Proclamations are not news. You can have Manufacturers Week, Small Business Week, Women in Business Week. Have a local face, have a local story. Look for the local story. Have a little sidebar on some statistics of what what that week represents in your community or in the state or national. But look for the local story. Just like the Red Coat Ambassadors are not a story in and of itself. Most proclamations are accompanied by the mayor presenting a proclamation. The mayor gets his or her photo in the paper enough times. So look for the substantive story. Labor negotiations, a tough one. Strive for balance. The dynamics of most labor, if you have a strike, labor disagreements, is that management, much to its detriment, is tight-lipped. It says nothing. It'll give you a 2-paragraph statement of anything. The union will give you press releases every single day. They'll send you photos of people on the picket line. You've got to find some balance. My one opportunity is to have the initial story that says, this is the basis of the disagreement. Give the arguments, give the points from both sides of where they stand on it. Then identify some sort of a benchmark throughout the process of where it is, where the negotiations stand, and then do the final wrap-up story of where did things wind up from where they started and where they finished. It's a tough one. You've got to, I think it's your role to strive for some balance in the reporting. Basing coverage on the what, not the whom. We've talked about that. Stick to your policies, and stick to the what. Also, letters to the editor. This is a slippery slope. If you reject a critical letter, you'll be hard pressed not to reject the complimentary letters too. So I think a quick story in Red Wing, the grocery store. One way to look at this is the private versus public issue. The grocery store was going to change franchises. Part of it would expand the parking lot and close a road. It was a road which led from Red Wing to Wisconsin, which were on the border for emergency vehicles. Public hearings saying this is really a detriment to be a longer response time. We published those comments. Somebody else reported and said, hey, they're changing the franchise. We're gonna have to bag our own groceries. They'll no longer do it for us. That did not get in the paper. That's a part of their operations. That was not gonna get in the paper. So I think beyond the public and the private, and that's one way of separating it. And then, yes.
Can I interrupt you before we move on to the story ideas?
Yeah.
I have another question. So somebody asked, how do you balance openings and closings versus more substantial business coverage, such as earnings/tax incentives, et cetera? In my experience, the everyday business stories do really well online.
Well, I hope that when we get rifle through some of the everyday business stories, I think there's a wealth of opportunity for business stories that when people read it, they aren't even reading it as a business story. It's just good, solid, substantive content. And I think that, you're going to have the earnings and that, but my point is that I'm hoping as you get through this, that you're paying attention and you're going to all of a sudden on a regular basis see these more opportunities for everyday stories to pop up. Online and print, I think that, everybody's probably the best judge of their readership and their best avenues for putting out the information. And, some people restrict the amount of stuff online, but also online can be an opportunity for expanding your coverage. So I don't have a really firm answer on that. I think that's probably an individual decision, discussion, but again, I would hope that following today, you see an opportunity for having business stories as a kind of everyday regimen of your reporting.
Thanks, Jim.
Going to go into story ideas. On your handouts, and I'll just go through these. These are, take these to the newsrooms and brainstorm. I can go through these rather quickly. I'm not going to go through every single one, but at the top of page 6, localizing, whole variety of ways that you can look at a story in national, state, and localize it. And I have some examples later on I'll show you. Put faces behind statistics. There's all kinds of employment and economic statistics. Again, pick the story. I mean, if you have a story on housing starts being up or down, or or the housing market is depressed in your community, talk to a realtor. What are the reasons for it? Talk to a beginning homeowner. Did you have trouble financing? There's a whole bunch of spin-offs you can do. You'll see on page so just think about the statistics. Think beyond the norm. Have that brown bag lunch. Have a reader's board that talks about generating ideas for stories. You'll see on page 6, COVID-19. I'm not even gonna go over. You've probably done all of these and more. There's a whole slew of them, and again. You can just look at what other people are doing too and localize it, bring it to your paper. Statistical snapshot, you'll see on top of page 7, one newspapers, they ran a monthly snapshot of stats. You'll see from consumer price index, jobless rates, tax collections, building permits. And, see what's appropriate for your paper. Run it a month, every other month, quarterly. Put the local staff, the state staff, the national staff, if there's corresponding, if they're appropriate. Look for a face behind the statistics. Pick out some surprising stats, some one that stands out. Do a story on it. Also, localizing stories. Again, I will on page 7 and on page 8. You'll see this is just from the Minneapolis Tribune, which is obviously the Star Tribune, the biggest paper in Minnesota. And I went in the last week, and there's a variety of stories there, and it just all of these are how you could apply them to your local audience. And some have to be done on the spot. They're spot news, but others are evergreen stories. You can do anytime. So Salted Away, they had a story on top of page 8 talks about thinking about the farmers herding, and you can think ahead for fall harvest season. What could you do with that? The same thing on the Think Beyond the Norm on pages 8 and 9. Whole slug of stories there. A quick brainstorming, but it's just broaden your story generation ideas. And again, some of these, the top 2, how important are exports to the bottom line of businesses? We had a local store in Red Wing that does high-end Scandinavian gifts. 95% of their business is exports. It's online. It's e-commerce. And there's a story idea down later below on page 8 that talks about, or page 9, about e-commerce, the sustainability measures. Those are evergreen stories. You can do anytime and give people an insight into what's happening in your community. Others can be localized on the spot, but what are businesses doing about healthcare costs? What are they doing to attract and retain workers? Right now, of course, there's a different dynamics with workers with the COVID, but also the big challenge now is trying to get some workers back because of generous unemployment benefits. That's changing now with the federal unemployment, and so you may want to. That's another story. When that stops, how is that going to affect the local employment? I am going to go on to generating revenue. All of today's discussion, I hope, is that businesses will notice you're giving more attention to business coverage. They'll notice packages, dedicate a page, a section, a quarter page, a half page, do it every week, do it every other week, do it once a month. Start small and build on it. Identify special sections. You probably do a lot of that as you develop as you develop business coverage. You can do more with that. That'll probably even become a springboard for more special sections. Develop events. Maybe have during manufacturing week have an event with the Chamber of Commerce. Compete with an evening meal and recognition. And then with events, you want to keep separation between news and advertising in terms, but I mean you want close coordination for the businesses. And for a successful event, they'll be most successful if you have coordinated planning by the 2 departments. Linda,
Jim, I'm back with another question. Yeah. Okay. So somebody said you talk about producing business pages and sections. We're a small staff and we don't have the resources to take on yet another area of coverage. Any recommendations for us?
Yeah, and again, I think that's kind of my baby steps is that right now, the reason people say you have a sports section is all of your sports news is on 1 page or 2 pages. The reason they have a lifestyle section, they say, we look here for weddings, engagements. They look at your food page or your travel section. If you took your 6 sports stories and put 1 story on each of 6 different pages, they probably wouldn't have the heft. They wouldn't have the feel of a sports section. So with business, I don't know how you do it now, but it's possible that this story puts on this page, this story on this page, this story on this page, package it. It may only be a quarter of a page, and it may only appear every other week, but start packaging it. Start putting the promos. If you have business news, send it to us. Start brainstorming some of your business, some ideas for business coverage, your everyday coverage, and put it there, and people will notice. And I think it's just take the baby steps, and as you give more attention to it, I do believe readers and businesses will notice, and you'll be able to build up the size of that package and the frequency of that package.
Thanks, Jim.
In your handout, I'm a big believer in explaining policies, newspaper policies and operations. There are half a dozen columns in the handouts. One, the Port Authority was trying to lure a big box retailer we wrote the column, we're not going to let you debate whether Target is better than Walmart or Feed Farm. But it was a big discussion. We were receiving letters the editor in comments, and it says, this is why you're not seeing them in our newspaper. Also, I did a column on the what versus the whom. We've talked about that, but it's a great opportunity to do those for doing explanatory columns. To kind of wrap up, I'd say focus on relationships. At the core of enhanced business coverage and enhanced advertising revenue is the ability of your newspapers to develop relationships with your business community. When is the last time you had the cup of coffee with the bank president? Or today, maybe do a virtual Zoom session or something, but just talked about anything. But talk about business reporting too, no agenda item. Just say, want to hear, what do you think about our paper, and have that conversation. Many newspapers too have that strict policy of not serving on local boards. And like I said, I serve in the chamber board, and some people would never let you do that. Some newspapers would never have that. But my point is, have regular communication discussion with business leaders. You should communicate with them as frequently as you do with government officials. You should have as much contact with kind of the informal hotspots of your community as you do with the cops and the courthouse and City Hall. Remember that improving business coverage is a shared responsibility. Businesses must be comfortable that the reporters will get the story right, and the reporters deserve to have the full set of facts, even those that may not be so flattering. So reach that common understanding, drawing a common understanding internally on what's news and advertising, and share that with your readers as you pursue your stories. The first step is to start that conversation within your newspaper and with your business leaders. Building business news in your everyday coverage, I'm a firm believer, will spill dividends both for news and advertising. Thank you.
Jim, that was terrific. I was just going to ask you about what the biggest takeaway would be from this webinar for the attendees, but I think you just really covered it. And
well, yeah, I think, have the discussion of how you can incorporate business news in your everyday news gathering. And also, I think have the common understanding with the ad department, what is the news, what's news and what's advertising.
Well, thank you so much, Jim. You covered a lot of material in this. And if anybody wants to reach out to Jim, his information is in the slides and in the handouts that you have. And as I said, we'll be sending everything out to everybody in an email, probably by tomorrow anyway. But if you have
happy to respond to emails, my email address is on the handouts, and that I'm more than happy to have discussion with you.
Great. All right, great. Thanks so much, Jim. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks.